Welcome to the Black Doctor Collective podcast. We as Black doctors are in a unique position. We can change our communities, healthcare, and the world. Of course, we start by changing the way we see and value ourselves. I'm your host, Dr. Shanika Horn, pediatrician and physician coach, travel extraordinaire. I am so happy to have you here and listening. So let's get into it. Happy Tuesday. Literally as soon as I hit record, the motorcycles have started going up and down my street. So y'all just gonna have to bear with me. I am really excited about season 4 because we are getting into the nitty gritty, the process of negotiation. And I realize I'm taking trips every month and I'm sure it looks great on Instagram, but I want that for you too, because I need friends with yachts and I need friends to vacation with. And so I need some of y'all to get on this negotiation game so that we could all be out of the country juntos. Okay? That's my Spanish for together. We need to be together on this one. This week, I am going to talk to you about asking the right questions. Okay? Questions are everything. Okay? When you guys are looking at jobs, or even if you're in a job, I need you to be asking questions, because so many times we have no idea what we've signed up for, nor do we know what will happen if and when things like crap hits the fan. I bring this up because people think that negotiation and creating a good job and defining the terms only happen within a very specific period, which is that initial negotiation period or the 1-year contract review, or whenever you have to renew a contract, whether it's a 1, 2, 3-year contract, the contract renewal period or the hiring period is the prime time that everybody thinks is the only time to negotiate. That's not exactly true, but we are going to talk today specifically about the interview process. So let's say you're looking for a new job and you want to figure out, is this a good job for me? How do I make sure that I'm not going to be screwed, basically, and that I'm signing up for the right thing? And it's really all about the questions that you ask, not the questions they ask you. Interviews are supposed to be bi-directional, y'all. I know. Everybody goes into the interview self-consumed. You want to make sure you look good. You want to make sure that your suit is crisp. You want to make sure your resume is crisp. You are trying to think of what they're going to ask you and how to best answer that. You've made a list of your strengths, your weaknesses, all of that stuff. You probably practice with a friend maybe. Who knows? Whatever you've done to prep for interview is always about how to present yourself in an outward manner. And a lot of people miss the crucial step of also asking questions. Or when they ask questions, it's the kind of question that you've designed to make yourself appear a certain way. So you're like, oh, well, I have to have a question because I don't want them to think that like I'm not smart, or I have to have a question to show my interest. And you guys end up asking like the world's blandest questions. No offense, I did it too. I remember in residency doing that. But those things are not going to help you. And then you get into the job and some situation pops up and you're totally blindsided because you never asked a question from the start. So that's what we're talking about today. Okay. Your goals. The entire point of the interview is to make sure that it's a right fit. You want to say yes to the right job, no to the wrong job, and know the difference. So you might be asking, like, how am I supposed to tell from like a virtual interview or a 1-day site visit what's going on at the job and if it's going to be a good job for me? I'm so glad you asked. We're going to do this in 2 parts, okay? So part 1, like I said, is mostly focused on the very initial stages of the interview process. And I'm not quite going to talk about your specific contract. That'll be the next episode, which is more like negotiating your own specific terms that you prefer. Your initial interview or interviews, because sometimes it's a multi-stage process, is where you're assessing the overall culture, right? The patient load, general call requirements, right? Support staff, who all go here. You need to know that. I have been in practices as a pediatrician where they have doctors, they have MAs, so there's no nursing support, which means a different thing for me. It means I have to give vaccines because medical assistants are not qualified to do that. Okay. I've been in places where it's doctors, mid-levels, and nurses, let's say. Am I responsible for supervising the mid-level? I need to know before I sign up. So even just getting a sense of who works here, so many people don't ask those questions. What does staffing look like? Who support me? Is anyone dedicated to my team specifically? Because something as simple as like giving vaccines we all have preferences. Like even in the clinic I'm in now, we don't have a nurse. We have some nursing students who are getting ready to graduate and will join the staff. But until we fill that gap, the doctors are giving their own vaccines. It's something so simple as I need you to leave the vial that you drew the vaccine from on the tray. Because I need to make sure it's not expired. I don't know where you drew that up from. I need to see the label, the whole Swiss cheese model to avoid mistakes or medical errors. All of those things are my personal preference. I communicate that to the MA, but all the MAs change. So like each time I got to be telling the MA something, I would have been much better off if it was dedicated. So now we've switched it around a little bit where I tend to have the same medical assistant each time and she knows my preferences. But just even how you work is going to be affected by the structure of the places that you're interviewing at. If you are not thinking about or asking these kinds of questions, you have no idea what you're walking into. You want to know what EHR they're using. Do they offer you scribes? Are they using AI like Dragon Dictation? You want to know questions about the patient community because most of us got into medicine and we had some really interesting ideas about who we were going to serve and how we were going to do that. And that has gotten eroded a lot. We have a lot less choice in who we get to serve. And so sometimes that means going to work in a specific community so that we can access a specific population, but we need to know that. I once did a locums job up in Buffalo, and the locums recruiter set up the interview for me, and I did it via phone with a couple of the hospital, seemed like administrators. It was like HR, I think the chief of pediatrics, and maybe 3 other people I never ever met once I got in there were on this interview. And I asked them, what's the patient population like? I was trying to get a sense of like demographics, language. Am I going to be required to use a translator when I'm in there? I did translation services so much in residency that I spoke Spanish. I can speak medical Spanish really well at this point. I used it so much and I stopped using the translator. So I want to know, am I going to get to use my Spanish language skills? Hola mami, hola papi, ¿cómo está? Like what's going on? But they had no idea. How do y'all not know who y'all serve? It was crazy to me. Anyhow, sometimes that gives you an idea of how disconnected the administration is from patient services. And that is probably a red flag because that means they have no idea what's happening in their community. And they are literally just focused on other things. Money. Okay, so when you're asking questions, you get multiple views, you get multiple answers. It's not just the direct answer to the question, which is like, what is the patient population? But it's also, is the leadership team even in sync with what's happening on the clinical level? Because that's important. If clinicals is not their priority, what are we doing here? Why am I here? Okay, you should be asking general compensation schedules. Is there like a base salary? Is there an RVU system? What would be required from a first year attending working here? You can ask these questions neutrally. Notice how I didn't say, what is my required RVU? It is, what is the requirement while working here. It's very neutral. You get information, they're giving you information. These are the kind of questions you should be asking that actually will indicate your interest and seriousness about the job, because now they're like, oh, she's really thinking about what it means to be here and to be successful here. And that makes you more certain that this is a good fit. It makes them more certain that you're a good fit. We don't get quite into the compensation of what you can earn in that position, etc. We'll do that next week. But you do need to ask some really fundamental questions. Now, one thing I do with my clients is I have a list by section. So compensation questions, leave questions, scheduling questions, benefits questions, right? We have a whole thing about all the different kinds of questions that you should be thinking about as you go through the hiring process, from the time you're reading the job description to the time you're going through multi-stage interviews to the time you're working through a negotiation, through orientation, because orientation has its own questions. Even preparing for orientation has its own questions. That's where you should be. But we are so often distracted by trying to get our foot in the door, trying to make sure they choose us. And that feeling of insecurity is really where all of our actions come from. So there's really two things you need to figure out for your interview process to be successful. And the first thing is how you feel about yourself. Yes, because like I said, we become internally preoccupied. If you have doubts, this will absolutely impact the way you show up. If you are desperate for any reason, you feel inadequate in some way, this is your first job out of training and you are like, I don't know, I'm just a trainee. If there's a gap in your resume and you're really internally worried about how to explain that. Some people have long maternity leave. Some people take sabbaticals. Some people just have, like I did locums, sometimes my gaps are as much as 6 months. If there's a test failure, you're coming out and maybe you haven't taken your boards or passed your boards. If anything like that makes you feel like, oh my God, I hope they choose me. I don't want to ruffle any feathers because God forbid that they notice this thing, they're going to want to go with someone else. If that is your thought process, if these are the things that you're terrorizing yourself with in your mind, it's really hard to even think about what questions to ask in an interview process, much less to actually ask them. So the first thing that I have everyone do is really examine what are the things that you say to yourself in order to make sure that they are not blocking you from showing up correctly in an interview. If you have decided a place is so prestigious, it's your ideal spot, it's the number one choice for you. If you have somehow put an organization on a pedestal, maybe their reputation precedes them, and you could just picture how good it's going to look on your resume. I know for me, as an IMG, as an international medical grad, that this conversation comes up a lot in our communities. So because our med school was international, you'll find that a lot of IMGs, especially if they do fellowship after or they're trying to do some other career work, they love to be tied into a U.S. academic center, because we've been told for so long that we are in competition with an American medical establishment, and we've felt the need to explain our international medical education. I personally am well over that at this stage in my career. I don't care. I didn't really ever care. I know the stigma exists, but also you're either going to reject me or you're not, and I just can't take on things that I can't control. If you are pedestalizing this organization in some way, you're going to find yourself overlooking some of their red flags, not asking enough questions, really setting yourself potentially to enter a bad work environment, or a work environment that's just not suited for you. And those two things are equal. They're just both bad because you really just want a job that works for you and represents you and gives you the level of fulfillment that everybody seeks when they're working. All of these things impact your interview, and you will literally go in there and people please these employers to death. Okay? Because you are going to be in there singing and tap dancing, trying to sell yourself on this place and trying to sell them on you. And that is just so distracting, right? Think about what you felt on any of your last or your previous interview days. I just remember okay, does my suit look good? How does my shirt look? Is it too low? I don't want it to be too low. How does my hair? It can't be too puffy. I don't want big jewelry. I just want to look like presentable and status quo, but I also want to stand out because I don't want to just fade into a sea of black suits and like all of these things. And honestly, unless you're wearing something outrageous, no one's really checking what you're wearing. But we spend so much time on it. You want to be comfortable. I'm going to wear flats and this and that. And I spent more time thinking about my outfit than I did thinking about questions. So again, really refocusing and addressing those thoughts that you're having in your mind before you interview is critical. You cannot interview as well if you are really just focused on how scared you are that they're going to take another candidate. I think the other thing people take for granted is that if they're doing multiple rounds with you, they've probably narrowed down to a handful of people, if even, or you might be their only really great candidate. You don't know when you're someone's number one choice. They don't really tell you that. Or they tell you, but you don't know if they're saying that to someone else too. They're also scared that they're going to not find a good candidate or that you're going to take another job. The fear goes in both directions, as does the interview process. You see what I did there? Bidirectional. Okay, let's keep it bidirectional. So assessing how you feel is critical before the interview. And I want you to do some work to build yourself up, remind yourself who you are so that you can feel confident enough to now focus on what you actually need to know in order to make sure this is a good fit. So I have my clients do a few different things that help expose what they're thinking, what they're believing that is limiting them. Most people aren't even really aware of their underlying beliefs and how it's impacting them. So I show them their brain. And then we have a framework for how to change that, how to be able to take action, how to build that evidence that you're a great candidate, and then how to talk about that. Because it's not just saying I'm great, right? You need to be able to present it in a way that appeals to the employer. And this is also a really good setup for when you're going to get to salary negotiations, is that you're selling your special skills. So you can get out of that mind spiral by doing these activities. Then you need to move on to the next step, okay? Which is to determine what is actually going to work for you. What is possible? What is reasonable? Possibilities are endless when it comes to job arrangements. You think in terms of what you need, and then a lot of times we deduct. So we're like, oh gosh, it would be nice. Or sometimes we don't even let ourselves think. I have so many doctors who think that they just have to work full time. And when I start to talk to them, I'm like, have you considered part-time? What would that look like? They all actually really would love that concept, but they just don't think it's a possibility for them. So there's things that you think are possible, but for someone else, not for you. There's things that you think are impossible, period. No job is going to go for that. And there's things that you don't even think about. There's so many, the possibilities are literally endless, like I said. And it really does go back to that first step, which is why I spent so much time there, which is how you feel about yourself. Because we love to feel reasonable. We want to present a reasonable offer. Don't fall into that trap, I beg you. Because you will start compromising internally first. I remember asking for a part-time schedule and I'm like, no one's going to pay me for 3 days a week. I didn't know that people worked 3 days a week. I assumed everyone worked full time. So I decided, okay, I would like 3 days, but I'm going to ask for 4. And I've done this more than once, y'all. Y'all would thought I would learn after the first time. Again, it's all about how I feel about myself. So my very first job, I said I'm going to apply for 4 days a week with this locums agency. It was part of my, if I have to go back to medicine that I talk about in the last episode, but if I have to go back into medicine and not be completely depleted, what does that look like? And for me, it was like at least a 4-day schedule. It can't be 5. And so I presented that, right? I didn't ask for 3 days and then we got to 4 days because of some midway compromise. I already told myself no on the 3-day work week. I didn't ask anybody. I didn't find out if it was reasonable. I didn't let them tell me no. Something about proposing something and then someone telling us no is so triggering, or I don't know if I call it painful. I would say it's stressful. So rather than have that conversation, which I anticipate is going to be uncomfortable in some way, I decided I was going to say no to myself first. That way they couldn't say no to me. I know the math, like when I talk it out like that, I'm like, this actually doesn't make sense, but also it feels safe. So that's what I was doing. Feel safe. I'm not mad at myself. I figured out later that it didn't work for me because it meant I was never ever going to get what I wanted because I was never willing to ask for it. I was too afraid. And so once that switch flipped for me, now I'm asking, I'm having these conversations, and I've really devised a really neutral way to ask those kinds of questions so that when and if they were to turn me down, which no one has yet actually, then I wouldn't feel so uncomfortable. And that's really what we're looking for, is we're looking to avoid discomfort. You decide what's possible. You don't limit yourself to what is reasonable. You don't tell yourself no. You don't limit yourself by saying, oh, I can only ask for so much. Oh, I don't want to be too much. Once you decide to do that, then you can walk into an interview able and ready to assess if they have what you need. Okay? You are there to collect information. So you're going to collect all this information. It's going to carry you forward into what we're going to talk about next week, which is asking the right questions during a negotiation process. And that will be you asking questions that are more specific to you and how to get exactly what you want at work. First of all, you're never going to enter an environment that off the bat is not going to offer you the schedule you like or be flexible. And you learn that in an interview process. You don't want to end up at the negotiation table and then have to turn them down. I have done that before. I felt so bad that these people had sent me this offer, this contract for a job I already knew after several interviews, knew a little late, but knew that I absolutely did not want it. Literally sounded terrible. But I just kept going through the process and I kept trying to tell myself, maybe I could figure out a way to do this differently, but I never asked. And by the time we got to the offer, I was like, actually, I think I'm going to turn the job down. And they were so shocked because I had been going along and doing the interviews and I had spent all this time really focused on how to present and to make sure that they chose me without realizing I did not want to be chosen. I want that for you to just prevent that awkward situation. Don't waste their time. Don't waste your time. It's all about asking the right questions in the interview. Okay, that's all I have for you this week. Y'all have already started submitting questions via Instagram for me to cover on these upcoming episodes. So depending on the topic, because I'm doing this topic based, I'm going to pull in your questions and ask them. So I did get a question about how to figure out if you're being lowballed or not. I'm going to answer that in an upcoming episode. So stay tuned. Look out for your questions. Keep submitting them. Thank you. I'm so appreciative to everyone who has submitted. So enjoy your week. And next week, we'll talk about asking the right questions in a negotiation process. Bye. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast. And what I want you to do next is link us everywhere you can. Instagram @The Black Doctor. Just become part of our collective. I want you here. Thanks. Until next time. Bye.